Greetings, everyone. Today's webinar is going to be on the brain and how brainwashing works on a child's brain. So I'm going to go through some kind of detailed stuff, but it makes a lot of sense once you start getting into the details. And I learned some things in preparing this myself. So before I go too far, I want to make a quick disclaimer, and that is I'm not a neuroscientist. And so my learning about the brain has been as a clinical social worker and family lawyer and mediator, going to seminars, reading a lot of books, journal articles and such on the brain, because this is such a basic part of our social human behavior. So the first point that I really want to make is that experience and repetition are how the brain learns. And it's amazing when you think about this, the detail that every experience influences and actually shapes the brain a little bit. So we're going to talk about that. And there's two particular sayings that neuroscientists use that really simplify and help us understand how the brain works. One of them is the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. So your neurons fire, and at the same time, they think, oh, I go together. So something fits together here. The other is use it or lose it. The brain has a whole lot of neurons, and we're going to get into that pretty soon. But if you don't use the connections between neurons, over time, they start to fade. And of course, as you age, you start noticing, now, what was that person's name? Things like that. And so this is how the brain seems to work. It's just on a huge, humongous scale. So let's talk about the child's brain. So the human brain has about 100 billion neurons, and that's just phenomenal. And I don't think anyone's ever counted those. But when you think of it, 100 billion neurons, that these are skinnier than a hair in our brain. And this is, most of these are there when a child is born. However, here's the key thing about experience is that the neurons, when they fire together, they wire together, they create a connection. And so experience is connecting all the things that are going on, things we're seeing, things we're feeling, things we're thinking, are all forming connections. These are called synapses. And while the child has these at birth, almost 100 billion neurons, they don't have the connections. And neurons can connect up to 50,000 neurons, connections between them. So one neuron could be connected to 50,000 other neurons. And all put together, there's a whole lot of teamwork going on in our brains. And as adults, we've filled up with all these synapses and connections, and we can associate things, we learn things, all of that. And this is really how the child learns, from experience. Experience is what wires the neurons together. So we're going to look now at a neuron. And as credit for this is the Human Brain book that I've enjoyed having. It's a big, thick book, but it's got great pictures in it if you ever want to get that. So this is an example of a neuron. And a neuron basically has these three parts. The axon, that's that long part there. Then there's the cell body, which is kind of the center of it. In many ways, it could be anywhere. And then there's dendrites. And what happens is these form connections. So as I understand it, is the axon reaches out and forms connections with the dendrites of other neurons. And so this is how it could be so huge, is it's just the networking here. But remember, the networking is based on experience. So if you put things together, like let's say you're learning to play baseball and you're going, I've got to run, I've got to throw, I've got to, keep my glove on, all that stuff. So all those neurons connect together in your brain and kind of form a team or a network to help you accomplish things. And so now we get into the fact that it isn't just experience, it's repeated experience over and over and over again strengthens these connections, maybe makes more and more connections. So let's look at the synapses. Now, synapses form different ways, but the main thing is what you're seeing, as I understand it, is axons connecting to the dendrites of the other neurons, and they form the synapse, and the synapse doesn't touch. There's just a fraction of a hair between them, but they send signals across. And so you get used to playing baseball. This is how you do it. You run, you catch, you throw, you do all of that. And the more you do it, the smoother it gets and the easier it gets. And the more these connections are made, and it gets easier and easier to do things. All this is happening without us having to even think about it, just automatically happening. And so what's interesting looking at this slide of synapses is that there may be multiple connections between the neurons, and that the neurons anyway, it's just a huge kind of network here. But let's look at an example. So when neurons that fire together wire together, let's say a child's hungry and mom or dad gives them a cookie, and the child's brain goes, hunger, cookie. All right, next time you're hungry, what are you going to picture? You're going to picture a cookie. And so that connection starts getting made. And if that happens more and more, then you're going to be strengthening that connection. That'll be easy to do. So your brain says these things go together. And so they form these synapses. But then let's look at this in alienation situations. So when a child's sad about parents separating, and one of the parents says it's all the other parent's fault, the child connects, I'm sad, and it's all the other parent's fault. So the next time the child's hungry, they think, I'm going to have a cookie. Next time they're sad, they think about, this is all dad's fault, or this is all mom's fault. And some parents say that. Some parents say that to their kids, that the divorce was all your father's fault, or the divorce was all your mother's fault. And so that's going to form connections in the child's brain. And they're going to get stronger and stronger the more that's repeated, because it's not just experience, it's repeated experience. And so that's really what's going on here. So repetition basically is how we learn to really do things, how we learn to think, how we learn to be organized about stuff, how we learn who we are, what to do. All of that comes from this repetition. Just think about it. How did you learn the language you speak? I was going to say English, but this is an international reach Family Access has. And so people with other countries learned a different language. How did they learn it? Did you sit down and your parents pointed at you and said, you better remember this word? Probably not. You probably heard that word. And the more you heard it, those are the words that stuck. And what's interesting is when people leave a place where they learn one language and go to another place that uses another language, after a while, they start losing their memory of some of the words they used to know. Now they're in a different land, a land of the new language, and the old language starts to fade a little bit. And that's going to be something that applies when we think about alienation. So if a child's given a lot of different foods when they're hungry, the child's not just going to think of a cookie. The child's going to think of, I don't know, broccoli or Brussels sprouts or turkey or anything. But the more that you have a mixture of inputs that go with that one feeling of hunger, the more you don't just think of one thing, you think of many different things. And this is how we learn, and this is how we think. So if a child's likewise giving a lot of explanations for what happened, parents getting separated and divorced, and a lot of things happen in life and nobody's perfect and we had problems and it's not your fault, and the idea that it's not a blame of a person, but a complex situation that's happened, and now we look at what to do. That child's not going to get stuck on going, it's all dad's fault or it's all mom's fault. They're going to go, oh, well, they moved, their jobs changed, they drifted apart. There's many things that the child slowly absorbs about parents being separated. But what if a parent is real narrow focused and can't manage their emotions and is just really angry and really tearful and really upset about separation or divorce? Then the child has repetition around this narrow subject, this narrow belief, and even narrow phrases that are easy to remember, like advertising, really stick in our minds. And one of the things to know is the way that our neurons work is when things are repeated a lot, you get a myelin sheath around it. And actually, let me go back briefly to the slide, the first slide about the neuron that shows a long thing with things around it. The axon of the neuron gets myelinization around it. And the best translation of that is it's like going from a cow path into a superhighway. It's the idea that the more you use it, the more it gets fast and speeded up. And now it can go really fast. And that thought just comes just like that. It's all dad's fault, or it's all mom's fault, because it's been repeated so much. Now you got a superhighway telling you that. And that seems to be the way neurons work. I don't know about you, but I still remember commercials that I heard on the radio and TV from 50 years ago. And why would I remember that? I never wanted to remember that. I remember growing up hearing some beer commercials, and I still remember them, even though those beer companies no longer exist. It's the repetition, and it can really build a foundation in your brain, especially if it's simple. Now, most parents understand the world is complicated and there's a lot of different factors and nobody's perfect and we make mistakes and we do well. But when someone's real narrow focused on blame, 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 that really gets that repetition to it. And so this is one of the key things to learn about the brain, is really that experience plus repetition seems to be one of the most powerful things about how we learn, not just how to play music, how to play sports, how to learn the language you speak, but also how to learn relationships, how you learn who you like, who you don't like. But this is also learned. And that's what's so important to know here as well, is what's happening is a child's learning the emotions that go with the words. They're learning the emotions of their parents. And so if their parent is preoccupied with anger about the other parent, that's taught anger that the child learns. So it's not that child's experience, it's what they're being taught, it's what they're hearing. And they're going, oh, that's what it is. And one of the things people wonder with alienation situations and alienating behavior is why it's so pure. In other words, why is the child like 100% hate one of their parents and 100% love the other parent? That's because it's not their real experience. Our real relationships are so big and full and have such a variety to them that there's things dad does I don't like, and there's things dad does that I really like. And same with mom. But when you get it from someone else and it's all negative, then you end up starting to think and feel all negative about that person. And kind of as a side note, this is how prejudice is learned. It isn't someone sitting down and saying, you know, those people over there, we don't like them. No one sits down and says that. They may say that actually, but that's not where it comes from. It comes from the accumulation. It's not one statement, it's the accumulation that's all negative. So if someone tells you all negative about somebody, then your feelings are going to be all negative about that person, especially if you're not seeing that person. So we're going to get into that. So I want to talk about now use it or lose it. That the idea is now we've got these connections, we've got these synapses in the brain connecting different thoughts, different experiences, lots of repetition and all of that. But the connections, the synapses, are really based on usage. So the ones you use a lot, you get stronger, it's easier to remember, all of that. But the ones you don't use, after a while, you may lose those. And that's why you can't remember somebody you saw 2 years ago, but you can remember somebody you saw yesterday. And so you didn't even think of that person for 2 years, and then something came up and you go, oh yeah, oh God, what was that guy's name? I remember he said such and such, but I can't remember anything else. Well, you may have lost your synapses. You may have actually had them pruned. And this is one of the things we're going to get into. But basically, these myelin sheaths get strong for what gets repeated a lot. And when there's not a lot of repetition, those synapses get lost. And what's interesting, and I've got some quotes here because I want to make sure you know I didn't make this up. This is what other researchers have said. But one of the things they're saying is the myelin sheaths in the brain that become superhighways form white matter in the brain. And you may have heard there's white matter and gray matter in the brain. So the white matter seems to be the ones that get used the most. So you build up experience, you have more and more white matter as you have experience. So as the gray matter decreases in volume, the white matter increases in volume. And so all these are connected and they connect rapidly. And that's part of how fast people go and how fast they have an excuse. So if your child says it's all your fault, and you go, well, wait a minute, what about this and this and this? And they say, oh, well, I was just pretending, you know, I never liked you, things like that. And you go, it's so fast that they have this image of the other parent and the other grandparents, and maybe even the pet, because they got a 100% negative message. Now, what's ironic here is the parent that's giving them the 100% negative message used to love the other parent, hopefully, when they had this child, when they were together. But now that they're apart, they can't have a blurry, ambivalent message, and so they have a pure negative message they're putting out. But their own experience wasn't pure, wasn't 100% negative. And that's why what's interesting to me as a lawyer is that the worst custody disputes are after the divorce for couples who were married. And I wondered for a while, why is that? And then what I realized is they're 100% living in the negative world about the other person. When they were separating and getting divorced, they still had mixed feelings. But now it's 100% negative. So the parents 100% negative, and the communications to the child are 100% negative. So the child now has this 100% negative view of the other parent, and their own positive memory is starting to fade, especially if they're not having experience, like they've totally cut off the other parent. In those situations, they're really cutting off not only the present relationship, but the past relationship may be starting to fade. So this is why it's so important, and I'll repeat this. It's so important not to let kids be isolated with a parent who's teaching the child these things, who's engaged in alienating behaviors. And so many times, courts and professionals say, well, what can you do? So we'll just accept that the child's over here. Well, it really shouldn't do that. And shouldn't accept that that's going to, because what that's going to do is create an all or nothing view in the child's experience now, as well as in their memory. So let's proceed here. I'll talk a little bit about adolescence. One of the questions I've always had was, why is it between about 9 and 14 that alienation seems to grow? And I was thinking developmentally, because as a therapist, clinical social worker, I've worked with children of all ages, so very young children for various issues, down to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And the younger kids generally just are almost immune to alienation, not completely, but almost. And I wonder developmentally, why don't they get alienated? And then why between about 9 and 13, 14, does alienation, that's where I've seen it the most after about 50 cases, as about 20 as a lawyer and about 30 as a consultant on these. And it really seems to be pruning. So remember, use it or lose it? Well, the brain does a pruning process and does this, first of all, I think around 5. So the child's just got all his brain connections and they're not going to be using all of them and they need the space. So you just think of your cell phone and you've got too many videos and photos in it and you need the space. So you need, to get a new cell phone with more storage. But the way our human brains work is they kind of clean out the stuff that we don't really need. And so your memories of being 4 years old, a lot of that's gone. Well, the same thing happens in early adolescence. And so there's a new phase of this. So the brain of the adolescent goes through a new phase of plasticity, which is flexibility and growth, in which the environment can have a major lasting effect on the circuits of the brain, of the neurons. So now you're starting to see why that age group in early adolescence is starting to lose some of their old connections from their prior relationship and are now getting this 100% negative message. And so they don't have the ambivalence that humans have. I had a professor in getting my master's in social work degree, which then I became a clinical social worker. And he said all human relationships are ambivalent and ambiguous. And it just stuck in my mind. And I was going, that's 2 weird words. I don't get it. I don't know what that means. I think I'm starting to get it now. Because all human relationships are ambivalent. They're based on reality. They're based on human beings who make mistakes, who do wonderful things, but they have good and bad. We all have that. That's ambivalence. And relationships are ambivalent. So people go, I don't know if this is the best friend. I'm not going to spend as much time with them as I used to. And there's this new person in my life. So we do relationship pruning in our real adult lives without even thinking about it. And that's normal, it's human. And that ambivalence, even in a marriage, yeah, we get angry at each other sometimes. We don't always like, what the other person's doing. Maybe storm out the door every so often, but we have the love that carries us through. So humans can be ambivalent. They can love somebody and be really angry at them and still love them. The woman, Temple Grandin, who's a woman with autism, and she's done a lot of work with farm animals, and she's a famous speaker and written books and such. And one of the things she says is that humans have ambivalence, have mixed emotions, but that animals don't have mixed emotions. They do one at a time. So your pet dog, your pet cat, may be intensely angry, intensely affectionate, intensely sad even. And that's what they're feeling at the moment, is one emotion at a time. May switch, but one at a time. She says humans are the ones that have these mixed emotions. But then she said, people with autism like myself, she says, only do one emotion at a time. So I can relate to animals in some ways that humans can't. And I just thought that was fascinating. Now, what's interesting about alienation is the loss of the ambivalence, is the child's 100% pure. This parent's all favored, this parent's all rejected. That's learned. That's not a normal relationship. That's totally learned. That's taught by someone else. That's not based on experience. When someone's brutally abused, and I've worked with children who were brutally abused by a parent, they still have mixed feelings about that parent because that's their own experience. They may feel much better to be safe and away from the danger, but they still have mixed feelings. In alienation, mixed feelings are gone. That tells you it's something else going on. It's coming from another source. So it's not just experience and repetition, it's also isolation. And isolation really contributes to people going through some of this pruning process and losing some of these connections, because the isolation is a pure message, and that often can dominate and take over. And like I said, the superhighway, the myelinization of axons can just speed this all up. And that seems to be early adolescence is part of why that's such an issue. It's this pruning. The brain more actively cleans out old stuff you're not using. And that helps explain, sometimes parents say, well, what about such and such? And the child's like, I don't remember us ever doing that, never did that. Or if I was smiling at you, and then that picture that you have of me smiling with you, I was pretending, I was faking it. Because the child's brain can't figure out that I have mixed feelings, can't figure out, why could I have been loving when I really don't have any love for this person? So it could be that that's what's happening. And I want to say again, with my disclaimer, all of this is what could be happening, but I think it makes sense. Now, I want to talk about the brain a little bit, about the hemispheres of the brain. So it seems that the brain hemispheres are kind of divided up with different responsibilities. So the left hemisphere, people are familiar with in terms of words, reading, writing, talking, listening. planning, logical, this follows this. And in many ways, it's the logical problem solving part of our brain is the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere seems to be much more of a relationship brain. That's much more processing our complicated relationships in the world. And this is the nonverbal part. And this is where we look to how other people are talking, what's their tone of voice. So when I'm talking to you, this part of your left brain seems to be processing the words, and this part of your right brain is processing the tone of voice and going, oh, I can't stand listening to this guy, or, oh, this guy is just so friendly, and all of that. Your right brain's following the nonverbal stuff, the hand gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice that come with the words. And so your right brain's kind of looking out for your safety. Are you safe or are you in danger? Is the environment a threat to you? All of this, the right brain is processing. And so the thing people don't get about alienation is it's not a logical process. It's a relational process. And so you think, well, that's, what the child's saying just isn't logical, doesn't make sense. I've had clients that were, the child would say, I don't want to see, my dad anymore, ever again. Child's 10 years old. How come? Why? Well, I don't like the way he wears his hair. It embarrasses me. And you're going, and that's the reason to no longer have a relationship. That's the reason. That's the reason. You don't know what it's like. Well, where's that coming from? That's the relationship brain. And how does the relationship brain learn? Well, let's take a look at the next slide here. So this is the cover of a book. And I'm not necessarily promoting the book. I think it's a good book, but it's pretty complicated. But the drawing on the book, and I've seen seminars by Alan Shore, and he really talks about the right brain of one person talking to the right brain of another, and that the language of the right brain is these nonverbal things, the tone of voice, empathy, respect, paying attention to the other person, hand gestures, facial expression, all that stuff communicates to the other person at an emotional level. And this actually, I think I may have had this slide a year ago, and I have a 1-hour webinar, which actually relates to this one quite comfortably. You could see that before this or after this. It's called The Emotional Power of Bullies. And emotions are so important because they're underneath the radar. They're underneath the logic. So say you go to family court about a divorce, separation, custody dispute, the child's resisting or refusing to see one of the parents, the court's trying to make logical sense of it. And it doesn't make logical sense. What could your father have done with his hair to make you not want to see him? And actually, that was in a case that I had. We were at court. My client was dad who was being rejected by one of the two children. And sadly, the judge didn't understand it's not a logical issue, because the judge said, well, sir, why don't you just cut your hair? Because he had longish hair. But that's not where it came from. It came from the messages the mom was giving to the child. So for the child, it was becoming a pure negative. Whereas up to then, dad was just dad. And he had, a little bit wild hair, but I don't think anyone else at court was thinking this guy's got bad hair. It's just that he's, his hair is a little shaggier than the average, perhaps. But that it came across, it was understood, it was misunderstood as a logical issue. Dad could not have cut his hair enough to make the child change her opinion because her opinion was learned from her mother. The opinion came from the other parent. Now, just to balance this out, it isn't just dads who get rejected by a child or alienated, it can be mothers too. So another case I had, my client was the mother, and the boy, I think he was about 12 at that point, was rejecting her. And when he explained to somebody, how come? Why don't you ever want to see your mother again? She's no good at math. My dad's good at math. She's no good at math. And that's why you never want to see her again? That's right. I never want to see her again. And where did this pure message come from? Didn't come from his experience. It came from dad in that case. Dad's teaching him repetitively and emotionally that that's the message, that mom's not good emotionally. And if you look back at the cover of that book, The Right Brain Psychotherapy, you see right brain to right brain. The emotional message from dad to the child is mom's no good. Mom's no good. Don't like mom. It's all mom's fault. And so the child's learning it with their right brain, but they don't have a left brain logical reason for that. And so we're going to get to that. But when you absorb emotions, then your left brain tries to start making up excuses, starts to make sense of those emotions. So we're going to get to that. But first, let's talk about some other parts of the brain. So I talked about right and left. So the right brain is where alienation, in my understanding, really is happening. It's a relationship issue, it's an emotional issue, and it's not logical. It's not about logic at all. It's about absorbing emotions from other people, important other people, like your other parent or the parent you're with most of the time. And by the way, I'm not saying that the parent that the child is with most of the time may be the source of alienation. I had a case where I represented a mom, and dad had about a third of the time, but he spent his time on the phone and when the boy was with him, turning the boy against his mom, saying negative things about mom, saying jokes about women. And the boy didn't understand at first that this isn't funny. And I remember my client told me, he said, my 11-year-old told me this joke about women that's not funny at all. And he heard it from his father and he thought it was funny. And his father's teaching him basically to be anti-women. It's like, son, you and I against the world, you know? And in that case, the father had that approach. He didn't get along well with many people. So anyway, the right brain communication isn't the logical side of things. So now we get to the amygdala. The amygdala is part of the brain, and it's in the middle of the brain, and there's actually one in each hemisphere of the brain. And so the amygdala catches other people's emotions. So let's look at this. So the author, Goleman, who told us about emotional intelligence, built on that in a book of his called Social Intelligence. He really opened up the world to the importance of the amygdala, and that the amygdala absorbs the intensity of emotion. So someone else's face may look really angry, and your amygdala is ratcheting up based on how intense that anger is. Well, parents engaged in alienating behaviors often have much more emotional intensity, so the amygdala is catching this, can catch signs of fear in someone's face as quick as 33 milliseconds. So fast that the conscious mind, think left brain, that's how I see that, remains oblivious to the right brain going, danger, danger, there's a problem here. So this seems to be another piece of this. So the amygdala catches other people's emotions. And you can override that. The prefrontal cortex can tell the amygdala, calm down, we're not in danger, it's okay. But what if you don't have a voice saying that to you? What if the voice just tells you the other parent is dangerous? They're terrible, they're evil, they're all these bad things. A child can absorb that, even a young child. Like I've had 4-year-olds that resisted going with the other parent, hiding behind the couch and stuff. And there wasn't a lot that was said by the parent they were with. It was their emotions. They were very agitated and angry or afraid or whatever, and the child absorbs emotions. Just as a side comment, Shore says, Alan Shore with the Brain book, says that up to the age of about 2, is children pretty much are learning from their parents' emotions, not so much the words, but the emotions. And so like a child, someone new walks in the room, the child looks at mom or dad to see, how should I feel about this new person? Oh, they're smiling. I should feel good about this new person. Oh, they look stressed and worried. And the child bursts into tears because they see that expression. So all of this emotional stuff goes on beneath the logical level. And this is a lot how alienation works. And that's why it doesn't make sense to legal professionals who are used to logic. Logic is why people do things. But I'm happy to say, I think a lot of legal professionals, lawyers, therapists, judges, mediators, are starting to catch on to this, but we're still in the early stages. Anyway, so the right brain unconsciously absorbing emotions. There's also another aspect of the brain called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons have been, getting a lot of attention over the last maybe 15 years, 20 years, as another relatively new discovery. And what they found is, and they learned this from seeing monkeys imitating what another monkey was doing, or even what monkey researchers were doing, and that their neurons would fire when they were thinking about it, not just doing it, but watching someone else do it. So when we see, and they've learned that this is true for humans as well, that when we see somebody doing something, our brain is absorbing that message. We're connecting neurons so that we could do the same thing. And just think of how this has helped people survive. If you see somebody suddenly running, then you realize, I better be running. And then you find out why. There's a big wave coming. Maybe there's a tsunami coming, and we all have to run. But you learn that first by seeing other people running, and your body started running because you figure, well, other people seem to be in fear. This is grabbing my amygdala and my legs, and here I go. Or fighting with somebody. So we copy the behavior of other people, and that's a lot of how we learn. And that's especially a lot of how children learn, is by mirroring the facial expressions, the hand gestures of the adults around them, of other kids when they become teenagers. So mirroring is another part. So our amygdala catches emotions, and our mirror neurons copy behavior. And so now we do the same thing. And you see this with children and especially early teenagers, is they're trying out different behaviors that they've seen with other people. I know dances and this and that, but they're picking up phrases and expressions, and they're absorbing the world around them. Well, if the world around them has one single message, and that is dad's all bad or mom's all bad, that's what they're absorbing. And of course, the synapses being pruned are taking away the positive memories. Now, I said earlier, the thing about the right and left brain is that the right brain absorbs the emotions of the parent. The left brain comes up with reasons for why the right brain's so upset. Why am I so upset? Why do I hate my father? Why do I hate my mother? They're not consciously asking themselves this. They just have this strong feeling and they're trying to figure out what's going on. It must be because of how he wears his hair, or it must be because she's no good at math. And so the left brain will come up with reasons. And Antonio Damasio is one of the early brain researchers and students of emotions and the brain. And he looked at studies where, for medical reasons, the corpus callosum between the left and right hemisphere had to be severed. There may have been some damage or some reason of that, or maybe sometimes people are born without the corpus callosum, which is the wiring between the hemispheres, that the bridge. Anyway, what they found is that they don't have that the left brain just runs with thinking up reasons for things that the right brain feels. And this seems to be the case with all of us. And this is the case with prejudice. So if you learn prejudice, just like you learn hatred for a parent in alienation cases, if you learn prejudice to a different group of people, because it's learned anger, learned hatred, etc., is your brain will try to make up reasons for why. Oh, those other people, they're not as smart, or they're not as clean, or whatever it is. Our brain tries to explain why we feel the way we feel. And that's so important to understand. That's the left brain, not based on logic, based on trying to rationalize what the right brain's experiencing. So we've got the right and left brain. We've got how neurons make connections and synapses and lose them if you don't use them. We've got the amygdala catching emotions. We've got mirror neurons copying behavior. So let's look a little bit at the next principle here, which is emotional repetition is stronger than just repetition. And emotional repetition in isolation is even stronger. That's where you get the 100% pure negative messages. So first of all, emotional repetition. So if someone's got emotion to it, that's going to be remembered more strongly. So commercials, things go better with, this drink, or you'll get ahead if you do this. And so you associate emotions with information that's repeated, that's stronger, because your brain pays more attention to emotional messages. But isolation, to me, this is where the huge, huge problem comes in with alienation, is kids being isolated with a parent engaged with alienating behaviors. And how misunderstood this is by logical professionals who are used to thinking that people are making logical decisions. Children make survival decisions more than anything. So if they're isolated with an angry parent, an anxious parent, a hostile parent, there's basically two approaches for survival. One is agree with the angry, upset, dysfunctional parent to calm them down, or try to get away from that parent. And this is a different issue. This is estrangement. And I'm going to be talking about this at the conference in 2023. Estrangement, in a way, starts the same place, but is a different kind of abusive behavior. In other words, the parent in alienation is angry at the other parent and favoring the child, so the child favors that parent. In estrangement, the parent may be angry at the child, may be emotionally abusive of the child, may be hostile, all of that, and the child's trying to get away. And so an intensely emotional parent is too stressful, is too intense for a child. And so the child copes either surrendering to that parent, giving up their individuality, or trying to get away from that parent. Alienation is the case as we see the child surrenders to that parent and accepts their emotions, their view of the world, their behavior towards the other parent, and essentially sacrifices developing their own independence because it's not safe. And an example of this is how when you have an unpredictable and intrusive parent, this often leads to an ambivalent, anxious attachment. In infants, this has been studied, and Alan Shore talks about that in his right brain psychotherapy book, says that infants can only cope with a certain intensity of emotional arousal before they move beyond their window of tolerance into a state of stressful emotional dysregulation. So with infants, you see kids just crying, unconsolable, that they can't cope with their parents' intense emotions. And so it's hard. So imagine a child that grows up with that happening with that parent, but the other parent's there, thank goodness, to calm things down and keep things manageable. Well, as they grow up, they're getting used to being overwhelmed and doing things to calm down that upset parent. And so in some ways, their emotions are connected or kind of glued to that parent's emotions. And so, it's hard for them to be an independent person, even though they'll talk independence. They'll say, oh, yeah, I don't want to see dad. That's my idea, Mom never mentions dad. I just thought it up myself. No, mom's constantly mentioning dad in that scenario. So to make that parent feel more secure, the child sacrifices themselves and becomes emotionally enmeshed, essentially, with that parent. Like I said, it could be dad that's happening with rejecting mom. It's not a gender issue. And this isn't an issue of physical abuse usually. It's this emotional message in repetition, in isolation, and it's so unpredictable and intrusive, the child's just trying to stabilize their parent so that they can survive. Now, there's a study that I came across. It's the impact of hostility and unpredictability on children. And this study said that children are more likely to develop mental health problems with parents with hostility and unpredictability than, say, a parent with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Well, the parents we often see in these alienation cases have hostile, unpredictable personalities. So the result of this is basically 3 personality disorders. And I'm not saying that any particular parent has these, but I often see these patterns of behavior, whether it's a disorder or traits. The study looked at these behaviors, including things like impulsive and aggressive outbursts, rage when being criticized, irritability, aggressiveness, tough-minded, exploitive, non-empathic, etc. Lack of reciprocal interest, sensitivity to the wants of others. Put this all together, and basically what you're getting, the impact of these personalities, borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, even just symptoms, not a full disorder, was found to be documented to predict behavioral and emotional difficulties in their children as early as preschool age. And when parents were not cohabiting, both parents didn't live together, the variance of the children's emotional problems explained by these parental symptoms increased more than 6 times. And this study wasn't done about separated or divorced parents. It was done about the impact of personality traits on kids. But if they're not cohabiting, you don't have that other parent to moderate the emotional intensity. So the child has to sacrifice themselves emotionally to calm that parent down. And I've seen this happen. I had a case where my client was a mom who was very anxious, and her daughter at 15 wrote a letter to her father saying, I no longer want to have a relationship with you. And her dad was pretty angry and upset about that. Well, my client mom had alienated her daughter against the father with anxiety. This wasn't anger. This wasn't sadness. This was anxiety. And this mother had been reprimanded by the court a couple of years earlier not to say negative things about dad to the daughter. And I believe she had really stopped doing that. She'd been very careful not to do that. But her emotional anxiety itself was so stressful that the daughter sacrificed herself and just said, okay, mom, I want to be with you. I won't see dad. And that helped calm mom down. Well, that's not how it should work. But the court case didn't go well because the court case had all this anger. The judge was angry, the father was angry, all this anger. And that just escalated mom's anxiety, even though she wasn't using the words. And so that's why I keep telling professionals, you've got to calm your own emotions when you handle these cases. You've got to deal with them calmly and respectfully to get the information out. Because when the emotions are so escalated, people can't think clearly. Anyway, adolescence, this is, it's such an important time of life. This is when children are becoming adults and learning who they are, what interests they have, all of that. That's, I think, why early adolescence alienation is really growing, because now it's getting mixed into their identity, who they identify with, who they want to be with. And alienation makes this much more one-sided, because kids should be looking at all kinds of people. And frankly, kids at this age shouldn't be that worried about their parents. They should be worried about themselves and developing a variety of interests. The last thing, few more things I want to mention here, because I can see I'm very into this, is when people are in 2 separate groups, when you're a member of a group opposed to another group, when you talk to your own group, you don't become more flexible, you become more rigid, you become more opposed, you become more extreme. And so that's another reason kids shouldn't be isolated with one emotionally upset parent, especially. So I want to wrap up. First, a child's brain learns from experience and repetition. And I can say that again. The adolescent brain prunes and strengthens neuron connections based on what they're using and what they're not. Use it or lose it. And adolescents in particular developing their identity and perspectives. Repetition of alienating behaviors increases alienation, doesn't decrease it. So if you let a child just be with one parent until they get comfortable to see the other parent, like they see a therapist and all this to help them feel more comfortable with the other parent, it won't happen, it will get worse. And that's what people don't understand. It's not logical, it's relational. It's because the repetition is growing, not diminishing. That's why you need family counseling for this. Everybody in the family has to change behavior. The person, the source of the alienating behaviors, has to change if you're going to solve this problem, or be separated from that person for a while so the child can regroup. Isolation from the other parent increases alienation. It's just a given because of the repetition. Alienated children are not independent thinkers. They're survivors. They'll say whatever it takes to survive. And if they're glued to that one parent, they can't say anything to professionals that would interrupt that enmeshment, because they feel like that, need that for survival. And removal from the brainwashing environment may be necessary for a period of time. 90 days people often talk about, to reconcile with the other parent. And then just like that, they're connected with the other parent again, because they're not getting those repetitive messages. They're not responding to learned anger and fear. They're responding to their experience. And that's a much more flexible, vague, ambivalent, real thing. So anyway, that's a whole lot in a short period of time, but I'm glad to be able to talk about this with you, and hope that this information is helpful in having reasonable behavior and helping educate others, because we need to understand the brain stuff's going on behind the scenes, and it's more powerful than any words that people say. And that's why we've really got to structure things so that children have a relationship with both parents. Thank you. Oh, and I wanted to mention I've got some books here on all of this, how to communicate. This is our BIF book for co-parent communication. The splitting book talks about the personality patterns that often are driving alienation. Don't Alienate the Kids really explains a lot of what I'm saying. It gives a lot of this, but today I gave you some new detail that's not in the book. So the book plus what you just got may be really helpful. And then our method of ear statements: empathy, attention, and respect. Calming people, calming each other, calming children. Don't get angry at the kids about this. They don't understand what's happening. Have some empathy for them. That's really going to be appreciated in the long run. Thank you very much.